Welcome everybody tonight. I really appreciate you all coming out and for the third of our annual deer meetings with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. And I'd like to start off by introducing some of the people who work with the Fish and Wildlife Department in the audience here. We have down in the corner David Sousville, who's a wildlife biologist at Dead Creek. I suspect many of you know David. We also have an ex-board member, and it was Claude Rainville. Claude, stand up, who served for 6 years on the Fish and Wildlife Board and still interested, as you could tell. And before I introduce the commissioner of Fish and Wildlife Department, I'd like to also thank the viewers online at Vermont Public Television for joining us. So this is being streamed live as well for those who cannot attend but still are interested in watching the meeting. So the last thing I'll offer is this is our third meeting, as I've said, and both meetings that we've had have been very, very productive. It's a great opportunity. In fact, I think it's one of the best opportunities for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department biologists to interface with Vermonters on the subject of deer and deer management. It's our opportunity to kind of tell you what we think we know and what our data shows us, and it's your opportunity to tell us what your thoughts are. And this really has been, this particular year, I think, very productive, trying to find solutions to differences of opinion on things. And without a doubt, we all in this room, and many who are viewers, I'm sure, are passionate about deer and passionate about deer hunting in many cases, in most cases. And it's important for us to still hold that passion, but at the same time, respect each other's different opinions and enable people in the audience to say what they feel and have that in a very courteous and respectful manner. And we've been able to do that on 2 meetings, and I know we'll be able to do that tonight. So with that, let me first introduce the Commissioner of Fish and Wildlife Department, who you probably are very familiar with. He's a relatively local person here, Patrick Berry.
Thanks, Scott. As you mentioned, this is my town. I know quite a few folks out there. I'm going to hand it right back to Scott. Just want to welcome everybody and tell you how happy I am to actually be able to stay here for one of these hearings. And as he pointed out, the Manchester hearing and the Lyndonville hearing were really, they were good hearings. There was definitely some differences of opinion, but there was a lot of great constructive feedback of folks. Hearing the report that the Fish and Wildlife Department biologists have created for everybody, and then offering some really good information. And I'd remind folks too that we're also here to answer questions. So after the hearing, we'll be here for a little bit, and we'd love to be able to respond to any questions that folks may have. So I'm just going to quickly turn it back to Scott. And again, thanks everybody for coming. You're here because you care about the resource, and that's probably the most important thing.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. I did fail to mention our young men in the back in green who are working daily in this area. We've got Warden George Scribner and Warden Dale Whitlock out in the back. Hopefully you're familiar with them, but not too familiar with them. So what we're going to do this evening is give a brief presentation on the information that we have, the data we have, and we'll start off with just an overview of the 2010 big game hunting seasons, and then we'll focus in on the summary of the 2010 deer season. Then we'll discuss winter severity. We are really still at the very tail end, I hope, of the 2010-2011 winter, and we'll share with you our thoughts on that. And we'll discuss some of the issues that we think are important to be looking towards in the future as well. And then it's your opportunity to ask questions and provide feedback to us. So in moving along, I think it's important to recognize that we really are living in an era of some pretty good times for big game animals. This past year in 2010, we harvested 6,869 birds. And there were times, which most of us remember, where you weren't hunting wild turkeys in the state of Vermont. And we also opened up last year for the first time new areas for fall hunting to try to take better advantage of that growing population of wild turkeys in the state. Our bear population has continued to grow over the past several years. The big game plan, which we are working under right now, sets the bear population target between 4,500 and 6,000 bears. We actually believe we are at or above that level right now. And we've been able to harvest this past year 530 bears. And we think it's time for us to start considering alternative ways to provide more black bear hunting opportunities in the state in order to try to get a better control of that bear population growth. This past year, we also, in 2010, harvested 488 moose. Over the past several years, we have had numerous or higher levels of moose permits available in order particularly to reduce the moose population in the northeastern part of the state. We actually now consider ourselves very successful in the fact that moose populations in much of the state now are at our target levels. We consider that to be a management success. And as a result of that, there were likely to be fewer moose permit applications available, or fewer moose permits available in the ensuing years. So for example, this year we'll be looking at something just over 400 permits. We do think that there are other areas, particularly along the southern Green Mountains, including Wildlife Management Unit I in your back door here, where we can still allow some slow growth of the moose population. Oop. One of the things that we also track, besides our harvested animals, is the mast production, which are primarily your hard mast of beech nuts and acorns. And that has an awful lot to do with the health of the wildlife. It actually has something to do with the distribution of the animals at the time you are hunting them. And it can have impacts on hunter success. Our beech nut crop this past year was very, very poor. You can see from this chart that there are only occasional very high beech nut years, but there are some moderate years along the way which are still important. This past year, as you are probably very familiar with in the Champlain Valley here, was a very abundant acorn crop, and almost to the point where it was the most abundant in the last 5 years. And this is very beneficial for our wildlife going into the winter. For the deer season in 2010, we harvested 15,523 deer, which was 2% above the 2009 levels. But it still was a harvest that was within our big game plan projection of a harvest between 14,000 and 18,000 deer on an annual basis. When you look at that deer season harvest total and break it up by season type, you'll see that the rifle season had 6,665 deer taken, bucks, and that was an 11% increase over 2009 levels, which was relatively good news for us. But at the same time, the remainder of the hunting seasons were pretty much on par with the 2009 level. When you take a look at the harvest by age and sex, you'll see that over 54% of all of the deer taken were bucks, some 8,400. And we just had around 9% being fawns and 37% being adult does. In looking at, of the successful hunters, how many deer did they harvest that in 2010, you'll find 85% of the successful hunters took only one deer through all of Vermont deer seasons. We had 13% take 2 deer, and a mere 2%, or 276 hunters, harvested 3 deer in all of those seasons last year. For looking at bucks only, there we had 96% actually harvested 1 buck, and just the remaining 3 point whatever percent harvesting that second buck. Archery season was pretty comparable to the year before, but down slightly, and it'd be interesting to hear your comments on why you think that might be so. But overall, the breakdown by sex and age was very similar to 2009. The youth season was almost identical to 2009. We actually shot 1,708 deer in 2009, and again, the breakdown was practically identical from year to year during our youth season. And the youth season in particular, this is a good time to point out how important that is from a deer management standpoint, simply because this is the season where our biologists are at check stations and where we can look at the entire deer herd that's out there and being harvested randomly by our youth hunters. And so before antler point restrictions, we were out there on opening weekend of rifle season, as you may remember. But with an antler point restriction, we can no longer compare that new data with the old data. But going out during youth season enables us to really see again those spike yearling deer and see what their condition is. The muzzleloader season, we had a decrease in the number of bucks that were taken during the muzzleloader season. But again, the rest were pretty comparable to the previous year. Many of you perhaps have participated in the hunter survey that is conducted every year. And there are about 5,000 applicants or surveys that are sent out. And it's very, very helpful for us to look at hunter effort by wildlife management unit. And that gives us an idea of how many deer are being seen in those wildlife management units. So if you have participated in that survey in the past, I thank you. And if you receive a survey request in the future, I ask that you participate because it's really very helpful information. When you look at this graph, you can really see actually the story behind hunter effort and the harvest of deer. When you look at the opening 2 days, you notice that the hunter effort, which is in blue, is less than the number of deer harvested, which is in that red color. And so the harvest per unit of effort, or for your effort, is much greater opening weekend. And then that following week, you'll see it kind of levels off. The amount of effort you put in, you'll get that kind of success in your deer harvest. But then you get into the second week of deer season, and you'll notice you have to work harder for that harvesting of that deer. And frankly, the easier deer have been harvested already. Perhaps the deer which are located where more hunter pressure is have been harvested already. And so we often encourage people, for deer hunters, if you really want to get out there and get that buck in the second week, you may have to go where people haven't gone before. The 2010 antlerless deer season is shown here graphically by Wildlife Management Unit. There was one Wildlife Management Unit, WMU-E, in the Northeast Kingdom, where there was no antlerless harvesting even during the archery season. And there were 2 units, O1 and P, down in the south central part of the state, where antlerless permits were not available during muzzleloader season, but one can harvest an antlerless deer during archery season. This is a busy graph, but the key thing here is it's a breakdown of our permits that were allocated by the Fish and Wildlife Board and the permits that were actually distributed. There were 3 wildlife management units that don't show up too well here, but K1, K2, and N, which were 3 units which we did not fully allocate all of the permits available to us. The remainder of the units, we did ultimately distribute all of those permits. Here's a longer-term picture of deer harvest trends in Vermont. One of the messages we try to get out of this is that while we did have some very successful, it seemed, or high harvests in the 1990s, it was clear those were very difficult for us to sustain, and that big game management plan that calls for a deer population that really results in a deer harvest somewhere closer to 14,000 to 18,000 deer is something that we're more in line to think we can support over the longer term. We do mention actually the pounds of boneless meat because we do think it's important for people to realize the role that deer hunting and venison plays in feeding Vermonters. And we actually harvested something close to 1 million pounds of venison that would put on the average Vermonter 5 meals available to them. And so that is a significant source of food for us here in the state of Vermont. We always try to make that distinction between herd size and herd health. And it's easy to fall into the trap, and I have many times, even tonight it seems, where we think more deer is better and is a healthier system. And we want to make sure we understand that distinction between deer herd size and deer herd health. And I'll try to do that in the next several slides. What we do is typically take the harvest information and model what our deer populations actually are out there in the woods. And we then can predict what we think the pre-hunt deer population would be for the coming year. And this graph on the lower right with the crosshatch bar under 2010 was demonstrating that the models estimated a deer population in the state of Vermont before the deer season in 2010 of about 138,000 deer. That's herd size, not herd health. If you want to make it more local, what did that mean? We do manage our deer herds, the deer herd now, not strictly on a wildlife management unit by wildlife management unit basis, but we look at groups of wildlife management units that are in similar regions. And this region here in the Champlain Valley is the Lake Plains region, and this shows you basically the graph of the deer densities that those models estimate for this region of the Lake Plains. And I think it is important to recognize that the red hatch marks, the hatch lines going across, are the deer population or deer density goals for the Lake Plain region as prescribed in our big game management plan. And so those are running between 16 and 21 deer per square mile. And in 2008, maybe some of you remember, it appeared from our models that the deer densities were above that range. We prescribed antlerless harvest to bring that deer density down to within that range, and our estimates for pre-deer season 2010 were that deer densities were now right at that mark. And so the idea would be now to try to maintain sustained deer densities within that region. Now we get on to herd health and not size, and this is when we talk about the physical condition of the deer themselves. We continue to take information on yearling or year-and-a-half-year-old bucks, their weights and their beam diameters, and you can see this is a long-term graph that in the 1940s and 50s we had very, very low weights of our yearling male deer, and now we're literally reached 120 pounds for the average weight. This is a very good increase in trend of showing and demonstrating a healthy deer herd, in our opinion. When you have healthy, heavier deer, it actually also correlates into reproduction and productivity. And so when you begin to look at the 1940s and 50s, you see that that relates to a reproductive rate of about 1.2 fawns per doe. And then now as this begins to increase, we're really looking at 1.5, 1.6 fawns per doe. It probably doesn't sound like an awful lot, but if you take a population estimate of some, let's say 60,000 does out there, that equates to 20,000 more fawns being put on the ground simply because they are healthier. And what those 20,000 fawns do ultimately is get recruited into an adult population that is part of our hunted population. So population size and health. And I think it's just important to realize too many deer means poor health. It doesn't mean a healthy deer herd. And so we try to balance this healthy deer with healthy forests. And if we can maintain a deer herd in balance with its habitat, we'll be able to easily manipulate deer populations to go up or down depending on what some things like severe winters do to that deer herd. But if we allow deer populations to increase too much and they begin to impact the habitat, it takes a lot longer for us to make improvements in our deer herd because of that. What we're interested in, if possible, is to minimize these booms and busts. Winter severity, managing deer herds at these latitudes is never easy, but the healthier we can get that deer herd going into the winter, the less volatile that deer population will be over time. As I mentioned earlier, we manage our deer populations by regions, groups of wildlife management units, and the focus here really is based on these densities and the population goals for each region, we are looking at a statewide deer population goal of between 102 and 141,000 deer. So now let's move into the winter situation. This is a great graphic, I think, to demonstrate the progression of winter in 2011. You can see on January 1st, the reddish tone to these maps really demonstrates 8, 4, 2 inches of snow on the ground. This is a map which illustrates how much snow is on the ground in Vermont on that particular day. And then you go to February 1st and you'll see this yellow and orange picking up. And then you're looking at pretty much more than a foot of snow on the ground. And then we come to March 1st, and as you get into green, you'll see that you run into 30 inches or more of snow on the ground. We pay particular attention to snow depths that are at 18 inches or above, simply because that is literally the height from the ground to the belly of a fawn deer. And we have winter severity stations scattered throughout the state where daily we're indicating how many inches of snow there are and whether we're at that critical factor. How did it compare? Just if you take a look at the date of March 16th in 2010, you'll see that we were really beginning to run into white in the Champlain Valley. The snow was bare, or the ground was bare, and we had some orange in the peaks of the mountains and scattered red throughout the state. And then you come to March 16th, 2011, and you see that even the Champlain Valley has red snow depths, less than a foot. But then you get up into the remainder of the state, and you've got orange and even begin to still have these green tones showing up, very deep snows. And as we continue to progress through, 2 weeks of cold weather now, in some parts it seems the snow is just not melting. This is a graphic of the winter severity indexes, which is based on all those winter stations I talked about, those weather stations. And the average generally is around 51 points across the state. We still are not finished with our winter. Places like where I live are still getting points for over 18 inches of snow on the ground. But we estimate that you're probably going to end up with some winter severity index somewhere around 70, 75 points, and considerably above the average. What's interesting is the severity of that winter is particularly clear in southern and western Vermont compared to the Northeast Kingdom. And we can also take a look at this regionally right here in the Lake Plains. At this point in time, we have about 46 points in the Champlain Valley, and that averages 31 points. When I say a point, that is a day that the snow is either 18 inches or greater in depth, or the temperature is 0 degrees or less. So overall, a severe winter for this area compared to others. Let me just backtrack briefly and just show you that it is rather interesting as I looked at this more today to see how many winters through this decade have been above average. And we've had some ups and downs, but still our deer herd is in very good shape even after all of these winters. So I frankly think that's pretty impressive. As I mentioned earlier, having our deer go into the winter in good shape is critical. It's a huge part of our management strategy. We can look at the weights of fawns and see that they continue to increase. And again, as the fawns increase in weight, like the yearling bucks have increased in weight, that means higher reproductive rates out of our females. So a few other hot topics that I'll talk about briefly are disease monitoring. We continue to focus like a laser on these two particular diseases. Epizootic hemorrhagic disease, often called blue tongue, is one which really can have some decimating effects on a deer herd. It has been observed in the Hudson River Valley of New York, so there really isn't much we can do, but it surely is something that we have to keep watching out for. Chronic wasting disease, you probably have heard the Fish and Wildlife Department talk about this in many aspects. It basically is a disease which can have huge impacts on management strategies for white-tailed deer. If in fact it comes to Vermont, the prescribed treatment is a depopulation of an area from as far as 10 miles out from the site where it is located. We do all we can at this point to try to control or limit the possibility this disease can come into the state. We have carcass importation restrictions on deer that are harvested elsewhere. I will tell you that Maryland and Minnesota have documented chronic wasting disease in their states, so now those states will be added to the list of states where there are restrictions on bones coming into Vermont. The captive hunt issue remains important to us for this very same reason, and we can use your help in identifying sick acting deer. A few years ago we were randomly testing our deer herd through deer harvested during the deer season to see if there was any incidence of chronic wasting disease. There was not. We now have decided to focus on target animals, animals that appear sick or not behaving normal. We're going to take those animals and have them tested. I will just quickly add one of the other items that has come up, and the department has conducted some outreach work on, is our concern or potential concern about natural deer lures that use wild or captive deer urine. And we would like to see and encourage hunters to move more towards the synthetic lures if they were to use them at all. We're actually very pleased that we've completed an important phase of our deer wintering area mapping effort. Deer wintering areas remain a key critical habitat to sustain a white-tailed deer population. If we did not work to maintain deer wintering areas, this kind of winter would have been devastating to our deer herd. And so we look at these areas visually from photographs, satellite imagery, and now we need to go in and visit these sites and complete the mapping to be able to identify these sites that often end up helping out in issues like town planning, where we can try to minimize the impacts on white-tailed deer winter range through our other land use activities. The antler point restriction is an issue that we've also been monitoring. As you know, it started in 2005 with a 5-year essential experimental program. And we've been monitoring the age composition of the harvest. And let me explain this somewhat challenging graph. It starts in 2000, and the gray bar on the left is of each trio of bars is the percentage of the harvest that was yearling bucks, 1.5-year-old bucks. The one in the middle with the crosshatch were 2.5-year-old bucks, and the one this light gray was 3.5-year-old bucks. And what you notice in the 2000s and 2003 range is we were harvesting about 60, 63%, 62% of our bucks that were being harvested during the rifle season were 1.5-year-old deer. And then in 2005, the antler point restriction regulation began, and you'll see that the number of 1.5-year-old deer that were taken was reduced dramatically. And we actually saw increases in the number of 2.5s and 3.5s in our harvest. In order to compare apples and oranges now, though, we take our data, like I said, in order to compare apples with apples, I apologize. We now take our biological data during the youth season so we can compare it to earlier, and we're feeling good about dropping really the percentage of yearlings in the harvest down to about 50% in the first 2 years that we were looking at these deer during youth season, 2008 and 2009. Interestingly enough, in 2010, the percentage of 1.5-year-old deer in the harvest rose dramatically, upwards close to what it had been, even above what it had been during the regular rifle season. We will monitor this. We suspect this is really a byproduct of a very mild winter last year, and all of those fawns survived in very good shape and were actually made themselves available to youth hunters that particular weekend. We also have been monitoring the percentage of spike horns in our population, in our harvested population that we look at. And if you look at the two groups of, there's 2 lines and a dot, and you'll see on the left is before the antler point restriction. In 2004, we were harvesting about 50% of our yearling bucks were spike horns. In the past 2 years, that figure had gone up to a little bit over 60%. And the dot represents 2010. We have not conducted an analysis to develop the confidence intervals there, but the percentage of spike horns appears to have gone up again in the yearling deer. And then the group of 3 on the right are the 2-year-old bucks, 2.5-year-old bucks, and you'll see that there is still a slight increase in the percentage of spikes in the 2.5-year-old bucks since the onset of the antler point restriction. We think this is something that we continue to need to monitor. We are currently in the process of hiring a new deer biologist, Sean Haskell, our deer biologist for the past 3 years, moved on through a promotion for the state of Maine, and we're now conducting a national search to get the best quality candidates we can to help us manage our deer herd in Vermont. And so while we remain engaged in the antler point restriction issue, we really want to hold off a public debate about that and discussion about that until we have someone fresh here in Vermont to help take a look at it again with us. Yearling beam diameters, interestingly enough, under the antler point restriction had also declined a little bit, and that was a cause of concern. But this past year, as you see on 2010, we did have an increase in the antler beam diameter. That may well have been a factor of the mild winter, who knows. The other item in the future that we'll be looking to consider is a realignment of some of the wildlife management units. These have been identified in our big game plan. The goal is to try to coordinate areas that are similar in habitat and deer density features and be able to manage them a little bit more consistently. Nothing is prescribed here on this side with the exception really of taking K1 and K2 and just making it one wildlife management unit K, combining them like they originally were. The changes in deer regulations now is that there are 3 deer that are allowed on the archery season in 2011, only one of which may be a buck. Also, there is a new statutory change regarding the availability of a mentored hunting license. And in the Law Digest, I think, is a pretty good description of this program. And the idea is it would enable a licensed hunter to take out an unlicensed hunter and show them really what it's like to spend a day hunting in the woods. And if that mentored hunter harvests an animal, they would do so under your tag. Now, this may be particularly attractive, I think, as it has been suggested for turkey hunters where you have 2 tags, and maybe you'd be willing to take somebody out who wants to try turkey hunting and have them perhaps harvest a bird under your tag. For deer, it depends on how generous I guess you're feeling that day, huh? The dates for 2011, we usually don't include this in our presentation, but the fact of the matter is, when the Law Digest was being printed last year, we were investigating and developing a public process to consider an early October muzzleloader season. And for that reason, there is really to be announced in the Law Digest, and there are handouts there I hope that you took, and I'm sure there'll be an awful lot of press about the actual dates for the 2011 season, which are shown right here.